Today, we will hear about the story of the life of Joseph and the legacy he left. I am reading from Old Testament book Genesis, chapters 39 and 50. When Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, Potiphar, Pharaoh's chief officer, the commander of the royal guard and an Egyptian, purchased him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man and served in his Egyptian master's household. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made everything he did successful. Potiphar thought highly of Joseph, and Joseph became his assistant. He appointed Joseph head of his household and put everything he had under Joseph's supervision. From the time he appointed Joseph head of his household and of everything he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's household because of Joseph. The Lord blessed everything he had, both in the household and in the field. So he handed over everything he had to Joseph. You planned something bad for me, but God produced something good from it, in order to save the lives of many people, just as he's doing today. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
You may be seated.
As a child, I loved hearing my parents tell me stories. I was especially intrigued with the stories that my mother told about her childhood because they were so very different than the childhood I was experiencing growing up in San Diego. My mom grew up in the hills of West Virginia in a little town called Beckley. She was a coal miner's daughter, and she was the seventh of 11 children. In all, there were 6 girls and 5 boys. And when my mom was 8 years old, her mother died giving childbirth at home to my mom's youngest sister. Well, after that, the boys were pretty much left to fend for themselves, but the girls were responsible for raising their younger sisters. This house had no electricity. The only running water was a faucet out in the yard. Their food were the chickens that they raised and the potatoes and the carrots they planted in their gardens and any wild berries they could find growing on their property. There was an outhouse in the back, and these 6 sisters shared 1 bedroom and 2 beds. And they each owned 2 pairs of socks, the socks they were wearing that day and the ones they had hand-washed and were laying over the edge of their bed to wear the next day. Their dad, when he wasn't at the coal mine, was at the bar. And when he came home, that is, if he came home, he was drunk and abusive. And it didn't take these 6 young ladies to figure out that the best hope for their lives was to get out of town, cut ties with this abusive father, and get an education. And so one by one, starting with the oldest, they left town, they got jobs, they earned enough money for college tuition. And then the next sister came along, and the next, and the next, and they supported and encouraged each other. And there were 2 teachers, and 2 nurses, and a mental health professional, and a business woman. My mother changed the trajectory of her life one decision at a time. And she wrote a story that she's proud to tell. Well, we're in week 2 of a message series called Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets, that follows a book written by Andy Stanley of the same title. This series calls attention to the often overlooked relationship between good questions and good decisions. In his book, Stanley recommends 5 questions that whenever you're faced with an important decision, that you pause and ask yourself these questions. They can help us consider the ultimate rather than the immediate. They can help us slow down, give some perspective. They can help us think prudently rather than simply. Because we know that the prudent, that is, the wise and the thoughtful, see danger and seek refuge. But the simple, the foolish, and the naive keep moving and they pay the penalty. These 5 questions can help us connect to the dots to a future that we would prefer rather than a future we might regret. Well, last week we asked the first question, the integrity question. Am I being honest with myself? Am I being honest with myself really? Now, we know that the easiest person to deceive is the person that looks back at you from the mirror. So I'm wondering if you spent some time this week looking in the mirror and asking yourself these questions. In Jeremiah 17, we heard that the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. So now that the problem has been identified, we know where to start. Be honest with yourself. Today we're looking at question number 2, the legacy question. What story do I want to tell? Whenever you're faced with any decision of any magnitude in your life, ask yourself this question: what story do I want to tell? Because every day, with every decision you make, you're writing the story of your life. And this season of life that you're in now, this event that you're experiencing now, will eventually become part of your story. So what do you want to write? Do you want to be the hero or the villain? Do you want to set a good example or a bad example? Do you want this to be a story that other people tell and is remembered? Or do you hope this is a story no one remembers or ever retells? And here's the good news. In every situation, even in hard, unfair situations, you have options. Say, for example, your boss asks you to lie to a client, and you do lie, and the lie is exposed, and your boss denies knowing anything about it, and you get fired. Or your boss asks you to lie to a client, and you refuse to lie, and you get fired. You still lost your job in both situations, but option 1, your story is, my boss asked me to lie, and I did, and I lost my job. But in option number 2, your story is, the boss asked me to lie, and I refused, and I got fired. Which is the better story? And graduates, I'm assuming this last year you were faced with some big decisions around studying for exams, and when you had a big test coming up and you knew that you needed to study for it, maybe you had friends that were out hanging out doing fun things, but you made the decision to stay in and study. And I'm guessing you did that on more than one occasion, and look at you. Now you're graduating, and we are so proud of you. Congratulations. And the year that lies ahead, whether you are going to college or trade school, or maybe you're taking a gap year and you're going to work a little bit, the year ahead is full of big, important decisions. And every decision you make, you're going to be composing the story of your life. So write a good one. Because decision by decision, you're writing the story of your life. But the primary reason that we don't always think of our story when we're making decisions is because our story comes later. The decisions come now. And we get distracted by the pressures and emotions associated with the now. If I were to ask you to recall one of your worst decisions, I'm guessing it might be an emotionally charged situation. But in the moment, your emotions, the draw was so appealing, so alluring, that you couldn't avoid it. And so maybe it's that first marriage that you regret, or that big purchase that you made. This cognitive bias is what psychologists call focalism, or sometimes called anchoring. And it's when the victim is hyper-focused on one thing to the neglect of everything else. And it causes them to lose their ability to think rationally. In every emotionally charged, decision-making moment, we think of our options instead of our story. So the next time you're confronted with anybody or anything that has this strong emotional tug, push the pause button. Step back. Not because he's not the right one, he may be. Not because it's not a sound financial investment, it may be. Not because it's not the perfect job or the perfect college, it very well may be, but anytime there's anyone or anything that has a strong emotional pull on you, it clouds our judgment. So hit the pause button, sleep on it, pray about it. Maybe talk to trusted friends or parents or a mentor and consider your story. Now, the Old Testament story of Joseph is a perfect story to help us see the impact that a story can have or that a legacy can have. Having just performed the musical Joseph in the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat right here at Messiah Church a couple of years ago, I'm guessing this may be a familiar story to some of you. But this 4,000-year-old story of this faithful man of God is a story worth repeating. In the year 1850 BC, 17-year-old Joseph, the 11th of Jacob's 12 sons, found himself in a tough spot that was no fault of his own. You see, Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his brothers because Joseph was the only son of his favorite wife, Rachel. Well, as you can guess, this fanned the flames of sibling rivalry, and the brothers eventually let their jealousy get the better of them, and they decided they needed to kill Joseph. Well, at the last minute, they changed their mind, and instead they turned to profit, and they sold him to the Ishmaelite slave traders. And then when they arrived home, they told their father that his beloved son, his beloved Joseph, had been killed by wild animals. And now these 10 brothers had a secret they had to carry with them for the rest of their lives, an embarrassing, heavy secret. So if you're at a point in your life where you are thinking about telling a lie, consider this. Whatever it is you're going to gain temporarily in the moment will not be worth the heavy burden that you will carry with you for the rest of your life if you tell a lie. Whatever it is you gain in the moment will not be worth the heavy burden of the lie that you will carry with you for the rest of your life. Well, Joseph ended up on the auction block in Egypt, and he's purchased by a military officer named Potiphar. Now, this was a defining moment in Joseph's life. He could decide, like most slaves, to have a bad attitude and do as little work as possible, or he could decide to pour himself and everything he had into being the best slave possible. I think we can all sympathize with Joseph because none of this was his fault. Someone had hijacked his story and taken control of his life. And it would have been so easy for Joseph to feel and act like the victim because, frankly, he was, right? But Joseph made the decision to pour everything he had into being the best slave possible. And eventually, Potiphar noticed. And he rewarded him by giving him more and more control of his household. Now, this is a story worth telling. But then enters Potiphar's wife, and Joseph's trajectory of his life changes again. Potiphar's wife insists that he become her lover, and he found himself, at no fault of his own, once again in a no-win situation. Now, he's got a couple of decisions to make here. Neither one is a great decision, and either decision really could cost him his life. So here's what he says. Mrs. Potiphar, I came to this land as a slave, and your husband purchased me, but I had no rights and no future. I did my best to serve your husband and to serve you, and through my hard work and with God's help, I gained trust of your husband, and he's put me in charge of his entire household. With me here, my master doesn't pay any attention to anything in his household. He has put everything he has under my supervision. No one is greater than I am in this household, and he hasn't denied me anything except you, because you are his wife. How could I do this terrible thing and sin against God? So, Joseph's option number one would be to say, Mrs. Potiphar, your husband gave me an amazing opportunity that I never dreamed possible, and so I was faithful to him and to God, who's been watching over me. Or option number two, Mrs. Potiphar, your husband gave me an amazing opportunity that I never dreamed possible, and so I took advantage of his trust, and I had an affair with his wife. Which is the better story? So whatever decision you are in the middle of making right now, it will eventually become part of your story. So consider your story. What story do you want to tell? Once again, Joseph chose the better of the two options. He did the right thing, and this infuriated Mrs. Potiphar. And she had him thrown in jail. But Joseph's story wasn't over. And the same is true for ours. Whenever we find ourselves in a deep or dark, challenging chapter of life, it can feel like it's our story or the defining moment in our story. But it's often the decisions that are made during these challenging times that help our story become a story that ends badly or one that ends well. Now, while in prison, another defining moment in Joseph's life, he decides to pour everything he has into being the best prisoner possible and eventually gains the attention of the prison warden. And then 2 years later, he finds himself freshly shaven and dressed in clean clothes and being ushered into Pharaoh's inner chamber to interpret a dream that Pharaoh had had. You see, Pharaoh had a dream that he thought was a significant sign to the nation of Egypt, and none of his advisors could interpret this dream. But he had heard that Joseph could interpret dreams, and so he invited it in and asked him to interpret the dream. Joseph says, to everyone's surprise, I can't interpret the dream, but my God, the Hebrew God, can. Imagine this man's surprise, this man who thinks he's a god, and you're telling him that your God can interpret his dream. Fortunately, Pharaoh's interest was piqued, and out of curiosity, he let Joseph continue. And Joseph said Egypt would experience 7 years of robust grain harvest. They were going to be swimming in grain, and this was really, really good news. But this was only half of the story. Because after those 7 years, Egypt was going to experience a famine so severe that had never been seen before. In other words, they were about to enter their dot-com boom, and then their version of the Great Depression. And then Joseph continued, and he did the unthinkable. He offered unsolicited advice to Pharaoh. No one ever offered Pharaoh unsolicited advice. He told Pharaoh that you needed to appoint someone whose sole job was to wake up every morning and store grain in preparation for this famine. Choose someone you trust and put them in charge of the grain silos, he said. And everyone held their breath to see how Pharaoh would respond. But he smiled, and he said, can we find a man with more God-given gifts than this one? And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, no one is as intelligent and wise as you are. And with that, Joseph becomes Pharaoh's prime minister. Well, there were 7 years of robust grain harvest, followed by, as predicted, a famine that devastated this region of the world. And when everyone's personal grain supplies were diminished, Joseph opened the federal grain reserves and he fed the nation. And people from near and far heard about this, and they came to Egypt to buy grain. And maybe you guessed it, this included his 10 brothers. Now, when they arrived, Joseph recognized them immediately, but they didn't recognize him. Remember, Joseph was a 17-year-old teenager the last time they saw him, and now he is a 30-year-old man, one of the most powerful and influential men in Egypt. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to jump to the conclusion of the story, but if you haven't read Joseph's initial reaction to his brothers, I want to encourage you to do so. It is a great story, and it is worth reading. Well, eventually, Joseph does reveal his identity to his brothers, and he showed mercy on them. Once again, Joseph decided against the gravitational pull towards bitterness, and he chose a story worth telling. He not only fed Egypt, but he fed his entire family and their entire families. His decision affected more stories than his own, and he wrote his story one decision at a time. Which brings me all the way back to the legacy question. What story do you want to tell? What story do you want to be told about you? Because every day, with every decision you make, you're writing the story of your life. Every financial decision, every professional, personal, academic decision that you make will become part of your story. And if someone has hijacked your story, remember the words that Joseph spoke to his brothers when he said, "You planned something bad for me, but God produced something good for it." See, I think God can take every situation, no matter how heartbreaking and how devastating, and wring something good out of it. Maybe you're someone who's carrying around regrets or a heavy burden of a lie. Well, remember the words of Jesus when he said, "Come to me, all of you who are struggling hard and carrying heavy loads, and I will give you rest. I am gentle and I am humble, and you will find rest for yourselves." So confess and then release these burdens to Jesus and start to write a new chapter of your life. It is never too late to write a story that you'll be proud to tell. So, in the week ahead, or the weeks ahead, as you are faced with big, challenging decisions in your life, I want to encourage you to push the pause button and ask the legacy question. What story do I want to tell? And then act accordingly. Because with every decision you make, you are writing the story of your life. Let's pray. Loving God, for the person in the middle of a big decision who is considering their options, help them to push the pause button, take a deep breath, and ask, what story do I want to tell? And then give them ears to hear, wisdom to know, and the courage to act. Amen.